So we are going to start with nationalist movements in Africa. Now, we've talked about nationalism before as the Europeans were coming into Europe or into Africa, going into Africa and utilizing that idea of nationalism, of wanting their country to be the best. Well, that concept is also going to apply in Africa, where Africa wants to be better, where it wants to throw off the shackles, so to speak, of the Europeans. And so there's this great quote on, or in your book, and it's by Jomo Kenyatta, who was a tribal leader in Africa. And he says, if you woke up one morning and found that somebody had come to your house and had declared that your house belonged to him, you would naturally be surprised and you would like to know by what arrangement. Many Africans found that on land that had been in their possession of their ancestors from time immemorial, they were now working as squatters or as laborers. And so many Africans are unhappy with the way the Europeans came in and just kind of took over. That, you know, if somebody just came into your house and said, hey, it's mine, you would be questioning, okay, why? Did you buy it? Did I lose it somehow? All kinds of stuff. And so the Africans are kind of doing the same thing. They're questioning, why are you here? What right have you to come in and take our land? And so there's going to be several movements for change in Africa. In the early 1900s, many Africans felt the impact of colonial rule, either by having their land physically taken away from them or being forced to work on it or whatever. Maybe they were forced to grow only a certain type of crop or only a certain amount of crop by the colonial power. The British, in their colonies, they made the Africans carry identification cards and restricted where they could live and where they could travel. Many of them were forced to work on European plantations or in the mines in order to earn enough money to pay the high taxes that were being imposed on them. And so they were becoming increasingly dependent upon the Europeans for handouts and that kind of stuff, and they just didn't like that. They had to sell most of their crops to Europe, and so that's going to lead to starvation in Africa as well. And so obviously there's going to be some resistance to European rule. And resistance is going to take a lot of different forms. You will have those who settle the land illegally on the plantations because they weren't supposed to live there, but they're going to set up a hut somewhere and raise their family there, all done illegally, but they had nowhere else to go. Others will form unions. Some will rebel against European-owned businesses. There will be protests, sometimes held outside of the businesses. In fact, there's one instance where West African women who ran the marketplaces in West Africa are going to threaten British officials who came in wanting to collect taxes, and they threaten them with machetes and sticks. The British will stop them by shooting them to death, but it's a way of protesting and resisting. In South Africa, where there was already a system of separation called apartheid, the whites had imposed the system of racial segregation, of separating blacks from whites, in something called apartheid. And this was to ensure that the whites retained the economic power, even though they were in the minority. They would retain the economic power. The blacks would be pushed to lower paying jobs. They had to carry identification cards. They were forced to live in crowded reserve or reservation areas. And so they were evicted from the best land, even though they owned it prior to the whites coming. They were no longer able to vote. A lot of different things going on. And so a lot of African Christian churches and newspapers are going to demand that Africans in South Africa receive their rights. In 1912, a group of educated blacks are going to organize a political party called the African National Congress. And its goal or its mission is to work through legal means to get things changed in South Africa. But it had no effect on the government because the government just basically ignored them. But it does build a framework for later political action, as we'll see later on in the unit. There is a growing self-confidence among Africans, however. Throughout the 1920s, a movement called Pan-Africanism is going to begin to help the spirit of the Africans, of uniting them and seeing themselves as a community. It's going to promote the unity of Africans and the people of African descent around the world, so not just in Africa, but around the world. The Pan-African Congress is going to be created, and it's led by an American, actually, an African-American writer named W.E.B. Du Bois. And in 1919, the first Pan-African Congress is going to be held in Paris. And basically what it was trying to do was to propose a charter of rights for Africans, of things that they should be entitled to, like being able to vote and being able to live where they want and being able to travel, that kind of stuff. Europeans are going to, for the most part, ignore this plea, but it is going to unite African leaders together and give them a stronger voice. Now, Egypt eventually is going to be helped during World War I. It had provided food and workers to help its colonial parent of Britain. But resistance to the British are going to come as World War I ends, and they're backed by officials and peasants and landowners, and the Christians and Muslims actually unite in Egypt for a while in order to tell the British that we no longer need you as our colonial parent country. We'd like our freedom, please. And so in 1922, Britain will declare Egypt independent. However, British troops will still stay behind in order to guard the Suez Canal, which was in the British interest, and so that's why there were troops there. So Africa from 1945 up till the present, since 1945 when a lot of countries started gaining their independence, 50 new nations have been born in Africa. And they all want to build a strong central government and have a growing economy. They want to raise their standards of living, but they encounter a lot of the same problems, like a lack of technology, natural disasters like droughts and floods, political instability, ethnic rivalries that still occur. And so achieving independence for these African nations is going to be somewhat difficult. This nationalist tide is going to carry them through, however. In 1945, Britain, Belgium, France, and Portugal controlled almost all of Africa. Only Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa were independent nations. And so this great tide of nationalism is going to eventually sweep through Africa. A lot of it has to do with the impact of World War II. World War II proved that the West could be beaten, that just because you're white doesn't give you a natural dominance over everybody. And the best event or symbol of that was Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. And so that was an example to the rest of the third country world that, you know what, we can beat back the whites. They are not naturally dominant over us. And so African soldiers who had been fighting in World War II will return home from the war, and they're going to be recruited by African nationalists to help fight for their cause, to fight for their independence. Another part of the independent movement is going to be just the global setting. After the war, Europeans were very weak militarily. Colonies were just too darn expensive to have around. And so they're very reluctant to hold on to their overseas colonies until they could rebuild their power. And so and African nationalism is really strong at this time too. And so there's kind of this push-pull thing where the Africans are pushing really hard for independence, and the Europeans aren't really pulling back, saying, "Yeah, we want to keep you as colonies." They really didn't have the gumption for it. And so instead what they're going to do is they're going to introduce new policies towards the colonies that will eventually lead to independence. And pressures are going to build up both within African countries, but also outside of African countries. Countries like the U.S. are going to put a lot of pressure on like Britain and Belgium and France and Portugal and say, hey, you know, maybe since we fought this war for freedom, you should give other people theirs, sort of thing. After India wins its independence from Britain in 1947, basically all of Africa wants their independence at that point. They want their freedom.